welcome to CNN Talk. We're talking about the Iran drone strike that we've been discussing on CNN so far today, but there's also developments in Khashoggi there, also MH17, asking the much broader question, are states able to act with impunity, which in relation to all of these stories are allegations that keep cropping up. Whatever the result of an investigation, you're not going to get any comeback if you get involved in these events. What do you make of it, Brian?
Yeah, I think that these states are trying to test the limits. They're trying to figure out what they can get away with, and so far they've been able to get away with quite a lot. And I think that's where creative politicians need to have better slap on the wrist diplomacy that sort of sets out clear dividing lines that if you kill a journalist or shoot down an airliner or shoot down an American drone in international airspace, that there are actually consequences. And the second you stop doing that, everybody else tries to test the limits, and that's what I think is so dangerous about this, is that it creates a culture of impunity around states in the world, and anything short of war is really what people are trying to test. They're going to say, well, I can get away with this because are you really going to attack Iran?
Yeah.
Are you really going to end the relationship with Saudi Arabia? And they're trying to figure out what they can get away with around the edges.
Often when we talk about these types of stories, we go back to the Iraq invasion and how that was botched, and arguably, and there's no appetite now to get involved in any interventions, basically, which could be military.
I think that's true. It seems to me in many ways the international world order is breaking down, and this has only really happened, I would say, in the last few years. If we were talking about things that had happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there weren't that many examples of states doing this. And it's difficult to see what the consequences are, because all the things you've described there, if there was an international concerted action against them, we don't know what the consequences of that would be. But there's a whole list now. You mentioned three, but the Skripal poisonings in Salisbury, clearly a state-sponsored action, and they've got away with it because, okay, the international community has come together and put sanctions on, but hey, Russia thinks, so what? And it's very difficult to know what you do in terms of reacting strongly against these kinds of things. I'm sure we'll talk in a moment in more detail about the Khashoggi incident, but that was so shocking that it's the sort of thing that you think is going to happen in a James Bond film, but you don't think really happens in reality. Well, it did happen in reality. This was a state-sponsored killing, and yet so far, some of the perpetrators might be held to account, but the people who ordered it are probably going to get away scot-free.
Yeah, suggestion that it went right the way up to the Crown Prince. But their response, the Saudi authorities, is simply, the report is unsatisfactory, and that's probably going to be the end of it, because where else do you take it unless you're going to get involved militarily or diplomatically?
And in the age of alternative facts and fake news, you can pump out a lot of propaganda to try to undo UN reports and to try to cause speculation around some very legitimate kinds of reporting and evidence. And obviously, it's extremely problematic. There is some pushback. Economic sanctions have been placed on Iran and on countries like North Korea, which are so obviously abusing human rights. Saudi Arabia is come to that one. It's an interesting one.
Just teasing the audience. Can I get the output? Thanks. The Iran drone strike we've been reporting on today, also Khashoggi's death, the MH17 investigation, all raising lots of questions about who will be held accountable ultimately. Are states able to act with impunity, we want to ask you today. The US official tells CNN that Iran has shot down one of the Pentagon's drones over the Strait of Hormuz.
The Iranians are saying that the drone actually violated their airspace.
It comes as President Trump now downplays these escalating tensions between Tehran and Washington. So, some other big news.
4 people are facing charges of murder and causing the crash of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17.
5 years after the plane crashed in eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 passengers and crew.
We now have the information, have the proof that the Russian Federation is involved.
Now to the first independent report on a murder that really shocked as well as horrified the world.
The report
released on Wednesday, says Khashoggi was the victim of a premeditated execution and Saudi Arabia is to blame.
I was able to listen to some 45 minutes of tape. What the recording indicates is rather something fairly planned.
Well, the Saudi Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Adel Al-Jubeir, has come back at this report very hard.
Khashoggi's fiancée, Hatice Cengiz, says that Washington hasn't done enough to bring Khashoggi's killers to justice.
Weapons sales, oil prices, the alliance against Iran, all more important than the killing, the administration has argued.
President Trump is either uninformed or uninterested in holding Russia accountable for this crime or Saudi Arabia accountable for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi.
El Mehdi on Facebook says the US can't risk cutting their relationship with Saudi Arabia. Alex says the world is lacking a Winston Churchill figure and is in desperate need of one. Lynn says, same old, lives don't matter, morals don't matter, integrity has gone. Are states able to act with impunity, Brian?
Increasingly they are, because the liberal international order is crumbling. And I think this is something where these states are increasingly doing provocations to figure out exactly what they can get away with. And what I think they're finding is, particularly with President Trump, is that he plays a bit of good cop, bad cop, where one of his secretaries of state or a national security advisor will, sort of saber rattle, we're going to attack you, and then he'll walk it back. And so it's basically this binary calculation. Either it's war or it's nothing. And in these sort of mid-level provocations, killing a journalist, shooting down a drone, or shooting down an airliner, it's not rising to the level of war because of the risks embedded with that. And the Trump administration and other Western leaders have not done anything that's biting enough to deter it. And so I think the more that there's this culture of impunity, the more countries will try to get away with other things like this.
Let's hear from Donald Trump from November 2018, where he refused to blame Saudi Arabia for the Khashoggi case.
Are you letting the Saudis get away with murder, murdering a journalist?
This is about America first. They're paying us $400 billion plus to purchase and invest in our country. That's probably the biggest amount ever paid to the United States.
Don't you believe the CIA?
They didn't make a determination. And it's just like I said, I think it was maybe he did, maybe he did. They did not make that assessment. The CIA has looked at it, they've studied it a lot. They have nothing definitive.
This, Kate, speaks to what a lot of people are concerned about here.
A genuinely honest answer from the president, actually an ugly one, but honest. There is some pushback on some of these countries like Iran through economic sanctions to say, you cannot act out of order, you cannot jeopardize our safety. These don't always work because a lot of the time in these economies, all of the money is filtering to the top and to the elite, so they don't really care what happens to the people, whether or not they have good trading partners, a good internal economic system. But there is some pushback. Countries like Saudi Arabia are more problematic, right? Because the U.S. has turned a blind eye, as has the U.K., as have many countries, to the atrocious human rights abuses that were going there long before they killed and butchered a journalist in the embassy. So, the president's actually being honest there, and I think that it's an area that the U.S. has yet to tackle and must do so. Energy independence is helping the U.S. to potentially get into a situation where it can separate itself from Saudi Arabia. But because of the international order in parts of the world where the U.S. does not want to put boots on the ground, it also does need allies, and it's a tricky one.
And they need oil, and they need these arms sales.
Max, what we're looking at here is classic Bismarckian realpolitik, where my enemy's enemy is my friend. That is why there is such a close relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, Saudi Arabia and Britain. We have to turn a blind eye to a lot of the abuses that we see, because it is in our strategic interest to have Saudi Arabia as a key ally in the region. Then you have all of the economic consequences of this. And you're right, Donald Trump was absolutely honest there. Well, it wouldn't be many politicians who would actually come out and say, yeah, well, of course we're going to side with them because we want their $400 billion worth of business. It's the same in Britain. Saudi Arabia is a key investor in this country. However, I think yesterday the Court of Appeal made a judgment which means that we will no longer be able to sell arms to Saudi Arabia if they're going to be used in the war in Yemen. Now, that was quite a major development, and I think will have far-reaching consequences.
I'm just going to bring up that statement. This was from the UK Court of Appeal, it does mean that the UK government must reconsider the matter, must make necessary the assessments about past episodes of concern. They're not getting rid of these licenses, but they're saying the government really does need to look at it.
Yeah, and I think that there's a huge issue here with the war crimes that are being committed in Yemen using American-made, British-made weapons. So this is an important ruling. I will say about the Khashoggi death, I mean, I'm a columnist for the Washington Post the same way that Jamal Khashoggi was, right? And I would like to think that if somebody else were killed and murdered in an embassy, that the answer would not be, at least the president was honest about our geostrategic relationships, right? I think this is something where we have to say there's a moral right and wrong, and there's not a binary choice here. You don't have to say, we will never be your friend again, we will never have any alliance, or we just say, well, they get away with it because they buy our weapons. The right move here was the move that every other U.S. president pre-Trump would have done, which is to say, we still value as a strategic ally in key areas of the Middle East as a counterbalance to Iran, but you cannot kill journalists that write for American newspapers that are residents in Virginia and get away with it. You have to have serious accountability, and there would have been some sort of action cutting off arms sales directly, or at least the president not praising them.
I think it's definitely the case that another president, even say George W. Bush, another Republican, probably would have acted in a stronger way. But, you know, I'm not praising the president for his moral position on it. I'm not praising any of us for our moral position on it. I think the question is, you know, have previous presidents been honest about our relationship with Saudi Arabia? That is one of the most honest statements I've ever seen from a U.S. president about the fact that we do turn a blind eye to these things. So it's not to praise it. It's just to say that, you know, actually sometimes I think even the virtue signaling that goes on in these conversations to say, oh, we really don't like what you did, but we're not going to change any of the meaningful policy. It's just a bit more above board now.
The role of a president or a prime minister is to act in their own country's interest at all times. And there are plenty of leaders all over the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, some in Europe, that it is in our interest to have good relationships with for all sorts of different strategic reasons. And we can become all holier than thou and wanting motherhood and apple pie. But in the end, it is all about realpolitik, and people need to get used to that.
The Khashoggi report, which has sort of brought his story back into the headlines, found this. He was a victim of premeditated execution, claims that Saudi Arabia is responsible. The Saudi government has blamed rogue actors. This was the statement from the Saudis. The report has regrettably presented many unfounded accusations, including the violation of a number of international conventions, and is totally unacceptable to the leadership of the kingdom. I mean, what does that mean?
Well, the leadership of the kingdom orchestrated an assassination. So, I mean, I don't care if it's unacceptable to them. The evidence points to the fact that this never would have happened if MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, was unaware of the killing.
How do you prove that?
Well, they have audio tape of the hit squad basically discussing how easy it would be to dismember Khashoggi's body, and then 24 minutes later, there's audio of a saw in the embassy. I mean, it's pretty clear cut.
But how does that link to the Crown Prince?
Because those people are on his staff. So they're, and you never would kill such a high-profile dissident in authoritarian states like this without the permission of the despot in charge. I think, you know, I totally take your point, Ian, about realpolitik. It's right. But I think what's really important to also underscore is that it's short-sighted if we think this way, because every despot and dictator around the world that sees these states getting away with these things thinks, I can do this too. And over time, it's actually counterproductive to our interests to not have certain standards that we enforce. Sure, I mean, we do have unsavory relationships around the world, but there used to be at least a sort of bloody nose or some sort of pushback when people behave this way, either with a slap on the wrist or sanctions, or at least rhetorical condemnation. I think that still is very important to deter future criminality.
Fred on Facebook says the world has no policemen anymore. That's one of the issues.
Well, Donald Trump tried to paint himself as an isolationist during the campaign. He claimed that all of his previous rhetoric around the Iraq War was in line with that. It wasn't. He actually did support the Iraq War. But there's definitely a feeling that, you know, whether it be Trump or a Democrat who wins in 2020, that the U.S. is not as interested as it used to be in putting boots on the ground. And that's one of the major issues we have. When you have planes blown out of the sky, when you have journalists maimed and killed in an embassy, at some point, someone has to physically intervene, I think, to stop that from happening. Because, as I said, the economic sanctions don't always stop these regimes at the top who still have the money and the power from doing these things. There's less appetite for it. We have to be somewhat sympathetic to that, because if you do come in and you do overthrow the regime, recent history tells us that it doesn't mean that a new one won't pop up or you won't cause more mess. So it's very, very difficult to tread through this water. I do agree with Brian, though, that if we have this information at our hands, we do need to be much more honest and much more condemning in our nature than I think the US president has been so far.
We can't have it both ways, though, because for years now, ever since the Iraq War, many people throughout the world have said America must stop intervening. It can't be the world's policeman. And now, of course, we're having this conversation and almost complaining that no one's intervening and being the world's policeman. So which is it to be? I mean, there isn't really, you talk about a binary choice. It is either be the world's policeman or not. You can't do it sort of sometimes and not other times. But the other point here, particularly with regard to the UN, is that there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy here. The UN has issued this report, and yet up until recently, and I don't think they are now, but Saudi Arabia chaired the UN Human Rights Commission. I mean, think about that for a moment. And presumably other countries in the world elected them to that. I'm not quite sure about the internal workings of the UN, but I think that position is elected. Well, what signal did that send out to the Saudis?
Raphael says, abolish the UN, it's useless. I mean, when it's got such a resounding conclusion to its report and there's not going to be any action off the back of it, perhaps you could argue that it was redundant, the whole process.
Well, I think one of the things that's problematic about the UN is the Security Council ends up having vetoes for proxy states. So if you're friends with China or you're friends with Russia, you get a veto and then no action is taken against you. We've seen that in Syria. So the inner workings are probably in need of reform. I will say that I do think that the West does need to be the world's policeman in some ways. I mean, I think that's the side that I would come down on Ian's question. Not just the US, but NATO and Western allies, because the reality is if you're in any part of the world and you're a dictator, there are basically four forces that can, police you in some way. There's China, there's Russia, there's the EU/UK, and there's the US. That's it, right? And right now, China and Russia are winning, right? They are pushing hard to support these forces of discord and chaos, and there's not much pushback. And so I think, the longer we let that happen, the more the system is going to break down, the more that people will test the system, and the more dangerous the world will become.
MH17 is another example we could point to. Shot down over rebel-held eastern Ukraine, July 2014. All 298 passengers and crew were killed. And these are the suspects, 3 of which are Russian, 1 Ukrainian. But they're not going to be extradited because those countries don't have extradition treaties, I don't think, in this case. But also, Russians are never going to give up their people, are they? They've got links to intel as well.
And this report has come out, was it 5 years after the plane was brought down? And I think that's part of the problem as well. It's not just that international institutions are breaking down, and it's not just that people are moving away from them and saying we're not sure they're working. It's that they're slow, and they're slow by nature. And in some ways, that's a good thing, right? Because they're actually trying to take into account all of the evidence. But when you're 5 years past the crime, I think it is even more difficult. Forget what the countries are actually saying about whether or not they're going to freely ship these people somewhere else to be put on trial. 5 years down the road, it's extremely difficult to even ask for that, I think. And that slow nature means that we lose even more and more faith in our systems.
And the problem is that countries like Russia really don't give a damn how they're seen abroad. I think they have, for whatever reason, given up on protecting their international reputation.
Or they want that to be the reputation, that they're tough and they...
Or they want that to be their reputation. Putin, I think at one point, did want to be seen as an equal to all the other world leaders. And I think he thought, and we can go back years and think what the reasons for this might be, but he, for some reason, feels snubbed. And I think there was a time, even under the Soviet Union, where if this had happened and they had shot down a plane like that, I think there might have been a recognition that, the best thing to do is fess up, admit it, say it was a terrible error, we completely regret it. But I'm not sure that ever crossed Putin's mind here. No. And he's just thinking, well, they think we're terrible anyway, so what's the point in pretending otherwise?
I mean, how does he want to be portrayed on the international stage? Is it all working for him?
Yeah, I mean, I think this actually does feed into his sort of cult of personality as this, major strongman figure in the globe, especially because, Putin's brand, even though he doesn't say it, is basically make Russia great again. He's basically saying, let's make the Soviet Union be what it used to be, which is a global player, right? And that's why he wants to, sort of test the limits in Crimea, test the limits with MH17, test the limits with Ukraine, et cetera. So this is something which Crimea, by the way, is a part of. And this is something where I think, Putin's mentality here is to simply sort of thump his chest and show, I can get away with this. And that's precisely why it's so important that there's a backlash. And the problem with Russia and with North Korea and some of these other countries is that the sanctions are so robust that there's only so much more you can do short of war. And that's the real conundrum that Western leaders have.
Miguel's picking up on your point about the world's policeman, how the West should be the world's policeman. He's saying it's just a way of furthering neo-colonialism.
I mean, I think that can be true in practice, but I think that in principle, some of the things that the West stands up for in the world are really important, and they're human values. They're not Western values. And so I think if the West is trying to basically try to help reduce human rights abuses, which of course the West has had very bad mistakes in the past, but is the only force out of that group of countries that I said that's actually caring about these things, I think it's worth doing. I mean, I think that this is something where if you are a dictator in some foreign, far-flung country, you want to kill journalists. You want to silence dissent. You want to crush your opponents. And the only thing that's stopping you is not your internal people, because those people are already getting crushed, right? They have no recourse. The only thing that's stopping them is international pressure, and that pressure is coming from the West.
If you're going to take concerted international action, it has to be meaningful. Yeah. If you look at what happened after the Skripal poisoning. There were sanctions. We did eject some diplomats, so did 30 other countries, which I was quite surprised at. There was a coming together there. But if you'd really wanted to send a signal to Putin, you would have closed down the Russian embassy in the UK completely, and other countries would have done too.
Or frozen some Russian business assets.
Better targeted assets.
If you just go for the sort of symbolic things, nobody's going to react to that.
Well, there's talk right now about targeting the assets of the Saudi Arabian prince and his family and his allies.
In London.
In other parts of the world, exactly. And that actually would be extremely meaningful, but again, could really ruin relationships actually in terms of investment in business and the things that the US and the UK benefit from.
We'll be back in just a moment. Let us know what you think. Are states able to act with impunity? We should acknowledge Steph at this point, shouldn't we?
We should.
Yeah.
Steph's the producer, and she's going off to have a baby.
I know. And we're very pleased for her, but very sad for the show.
Yes.
Indeed.
Come back soon.
Wish her all the best.
And congratulations.
Yeah, very exciting.
Richard on Facebook, meanwhile, says on this much bigger issue, there are no laws in the world now. I mean...
that's not true, right? There's international law.
Yeah.
And there's also domestic law.
But how seriously is it being taken if these events are carrying on, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is international law. I think that a lot of countries flout it with impunity. And that's an indictment of the UN. It's an indictment of international institutions. But it's also, I mean, it used to be that some of this international law had force because there would be consequences. And Ian's totally right. I mean, you can't deter anyone with slaps on the wrist, and it almost becomes a charade, right? We expel 30 of your people, you expel 30 of ours back, and everyone knows what's going to happen, so they just do it anyway. You'd have to actually take some concerted effort, but I think you should, right?
But also, when you have the world's greatest superpower withdrawing from international organisations, I mean, some of which I would agree with, UNESCO, for example, I would agree with, but withdrawing from the International Criminal Court in The Hague, what signal does that send to people who might want to transgress international law?
Yeah. But it's, NATO spending does need to go up, so there's right pushback there.
We're asking, are states able to act with impunity? We've discussed Khashoggi. We've talked about MH17 as well. We're also going to talk about Iran, because that's something that you might argue is a different case. Just in the last day or so, there was a drone attack in the Strait of Hormuz. Iranians have accepted they attacked an American drone, but they say it was in Iranian airspace. Americans say it was international airspace. Here's the reaction from the Revolutionary Guard. The downing of the American drone is an open, clear and categorical message, which is the defenders of the borders of Iran will decisively deal with any foreign aggression. But there's this debate about whether or not they had crossed into Iranian territory.
Well, look, I don't know about drone technology, but I would have thought one side or the other would be able to prove where that drone was when it was shot down. So until that time, if that drone was in Iranian airspace, I would argue, you might be surprised to hear, the Iranians had every right to shoot it down.
And how's it playing to the other attacks that are still sort of in a grey area?
Well, until we know the circumstances, it's very difficult. If it was an international airspace, then I think the Iranians have got a bit of a problem. But what's anyone going to do about that? It was a drone.
Do you think the Iranians are acting with impunity in that area with these alleged attacks on shipping?
Well, this is just a back and forth between Iran and the U.S. escalating tensions. They've also announced that they're about to surpass the amount of low-enriched uranium that they've been producing, which would technically be in breach of the Iran nuclear deal, but the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of under Donald Trump's administration. And I mean, this is just a back and forth where, as Ian says, at the moment, it's a drone. It's not a human life. I suspect it will continue to increase. Are they acting without impunity? I don't know. I mean, Iran really didn't want those economic sanctions and worked with President Obama to lessen them. So there's, to some extent, evidence that they actually want to play with the rational actors of the world, but certainly are trying to increase tensions.
I think that the more interesting thing is Trump's response to this, which has not been as you might imagine it would be.
Let's have a listen to that. He spoke to Sean Hannity last night.
As you look at the geopolitical work up there, Iran, Russia, China, tell me your concerns.
Don't worry about a thing. Everything's under control. The Iran deal that was made by President Obama paid $150 billion, paid $1.8 billion in cash. I terminated that, and Iran is a much different country. I will tell you, much different today than when I took over. When I took over, it looked like there was no stopping them. Right now,
will you say they never get nukes?
But
they
we'll
never get nuclear weapons?
I would say, if I were you, don't worry about a thing.
Are you worried, Brian?
I am worried. There's a lot of stuff in that was also factually wrong, by the way. I mean, in terms of Iran was completely compliant with the terms of the nuclear deal, and Trump's own advisors, national security advisor, et cetera, agreed with that. But yeah, I am worried. I mean, I think this is something that has the possibility of spiraling out of control due to miscalculation. And I also think that this back and forth of where the drone was shows exactly what you need in an international crisis is credibility. And you also need allies who quickly line up and back you, right? And if you think about what the first 2.5 years of Trump's presidency have attacked, they have been a masterclass on how to destroy American credibility from the White House and also how to undercut our relationships with allies by bashing them relentlessly. And so as these things start to escalate, normally you would have everybody in NATO lining up immediately and saying, we agree with this assessment and we will defend American interests. You're not hearing that as much, right? The same thing is true with...
they haven't got evidence?
Well, it's also because they're probably trying to independently verify it because there have been so many lies coming out of the White House in the last 2.5 years that you can't just take it at its word anymore, and I think that's a problem.
That's really important, because when we think back to the attacks on the 2 oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, even though there's video, which the White House say is clear proof that it was the Revolutionary Guard, it was the Iranians that did this, I think the majority of people in the West don't believe that. How have we got to this point where people are more willing to believe the Iranian government than the American government?
Let's have a look at the word cloud. These are the words coming out of the comments coming into us. What do you make of it, Kate?
Impunity and Trump, high up there. Look, there's an elephant in the room, which is that the US and the UK have also benefited from impunity. And I completely agree with Brian that the West in general is standing up for certain human rights all over the world in ways that other countries are, and you know, we need to give preference to that. But when it comes to things like the drone strikes that President Obama actually escalated from George W. Bush's time, and comes to things like the Iraq War, there have been major questions about the way that these superpowers have acted. And I think it also speaks to this point about credibility. I mean, nobody can always be perfect. That is impossible, especially if you are deemed the policeman of the world. You're going to get things wrong. We haven't always been honest with ourselves about where we've gotten that wrong. We have overstepped the line from time to time. And I think that goes to the point about institutions breaking down, but also the people that are supposed to always be upholding these human rights aren't so perfect at it.
Mohammed, picking up on your point, delay of justice is injustice, talking about the length of these investigations.
Indeed.
Ozulua says, follow the money to understand state actions and reactions. That goes back to that soundbite from Trump.
There is a big point in that, isn't there? In that if your economy is benefiting to the tune of billions of dollars from Saudi investment, it will take a very brave politician...
And traded on wages and stock markets.
Yeah, and it'll take a very brave politician to say to, I don't know, 100,000 American workers, sorry, your jobs are going because I've made the decision that I'm going to break off diplomatic relations with this country. A lot of people will find that difficult to swallow.
Is the issue partly then that voters should take more responsibility? They care less about these international issues than local issues? Yeah,
I mean, this is a problem with the modern state of democracy, is that foreign policy issues on moral leadership are not top of the list. And so I think people are not going to vote in 2020, for example, based on who has a more morally righteous stance towards Saudi Arabia or Iran. But it's also why it's incumbent on leaders to step up to the plate and say, look, this is how the country is perceived globally, and that actually is a core interest of the United States, that the way that we're perceived around the world allows us to achieve our goals more readily because people respect us or trust us or believe what we say when we say a drone is in their airspace rather than ours, and all that stuff ends up mattering. It's just not immediately apparent on the day-to-day business of politics.
And we need to start looking down the line to see who the new abusers are going to be. I mean, you now have EU member states that aren't upholding freedom of the press.
America
Hungary
can't be a world cop, according to one comment. The UN Security Council veto is the problem. It's a farce, says Nora. And Cease says, start with removing all veto rights at the UN Security Council. They don't bring peace to the world, but break it to pieces. What do you think? You can have your say on our Facebook feed. Thank you for watching, also listening if you're on Apple Podcasts. You can go back and listen to the show again. Look up CNN Talk.